In the winter ledger of the Deschutes County clerk's office, the line is plain and final. Presumed dead by exposure. Bodies not recovered. The names beneath it are written in the careful hand of a deputy who never met them, because by the time the ink dried, there was nothing left to identify. No remains, no clothing worth cataloging, no pocket watch to stop the guessing. They vanished in Central Oregon in January of 1911 on a route so ordinary that it rarely earned a mention in the papers. Their disappearance was not the sort that attracts myth. There were no outlaw stories attached to it, no whispered feuds, no moral parable that editors could sell. It was, on its face, an absence. 3 men walking into timbered country and never walking out again. Their names were Lawrence Laurie Dyer, age 34, Charles Hatton, age 41, and Henry Klein, age 26. 2 were seasoned in the region's winter work. The third had arrived only months earlier, drawn by the wages tied to a new kind of frontier, wire, poles, insulators, and the quiet spread of telephone lines that promised to stitch isolated towns into a single nervous system. A historian can reconstruct their last week because they left behind the kind of paper trail that ordinary people rarely notice until it's too late. There is a freight receipt from the Shanico railhead. There are the time-stamped notes of a telephone exchange operator in Bend who wrote down every long-distance call as if it were scripture. There is a pocket diary, 2 pages only, kept by Hatton, preserved because his wife later pressed it into a church Bible and could not bring herself to discard it. In those records, the men are unremarkable. They argue about costs. They complain about boots. They discuss whether to hire a 4th hand for a day. They plan the route as working men plan routes, not as an adventure, but as a calculation. The job was simple in concept and difficult in execution. A line crew was needed to reach a small logging camp on the upper Metolius, where a spur of winter cutting had begun earlier than usual. The camp's foreman had sent word that a man had been injured and needed transport to town, and that the camp's supply order had been delayed. The line crew was not a rescue team, but it was the only group in Bend with a pair of snowshoes, a mule harness, and enough authority to carry a message back without being turned away. They were to leave Bend, head northwest along the wagon road for as far as conditions allowed, and then cut up toward the Metolius Basin on established trails used by trappers and timber scouts. If they followed the usual route, it would cost them a full day. And there, on the evening of January 12th, in a back room behind a general store that smelled of lamp oil and dried apples, the decision appears for the first time in the documentary record. Klein, the youngest, had been shown a shortcut on a government survey map, a thin, confident line penciled between 2 drainages. It promised to save hours by avoiding a long swing south around the ridge. Dyer had walked the longer route in summer and knew it. Hatton, older and proud, disliked the idea of wasting daylight on a wide curve when the camp was straight as a string from where they stood. There are no speeches recorded. No dramatic dissent, only a sentence in Hatton's diary, written with the bluntness of someone who believed he was noting a minor detail. We take the shortcut over the spur, should make camp by dark. It was the kind of choice people make when they are tired of caution, when the map looks clearer than the land, when a line on paper feels like a promise. It was the decision that would later define everything, because once they stepped off the known road and onto the spur, the remaining outcomes narrowed quietly, to a point. Bend's early telephone exchange required operators to log every long-distance call by time and party. Those handwritten logs later became one of the few fixed timestamps in the case. To understand why the shortcut seemed reasonable, it helps to understand what winter work looked like in Central Oregon in 1911. The region was not empty wilderness. It was a working landscape. Timber claims, small camps, wagons cut deep into snow, and the steady hum of expansion. Men moved through it with the confidence of people who believed they knew its temperament. Dyer had come west from Iowa nearly a decade earlier, and in a letter to his brother he once described Oregon winter as hard but honest. No tricks if you pay attention. He was employed by a local utility contractor that handled pole setting, line repair, and emergency work for the telephone company. He was not a romantic. His wages, his hours, and his health were recorded with a bookkeeper's precision. Hatton was older and had the reputation of being steady, which meant that when others complained, he continued. He had worked on bridge crews, then moved into line work because it kept him closer to town. He had a wife and one child. In his diary, he wrote of small things: the price of flour, the condition of his hands, the sound of wind at night. Klein, the youngest, was new enough that he still paid attention to the novelty of the place. In the testimony his landlady later gave to the sheriff, she described him as polite, restless, always reading papers. That matters because the shortcut did not originate as a reckless idea. It originated as an idea that felt modern. By 1911, the United States Geological Survey had published increasingly detailed topographic sheets for parts of Oregon, and survey lines, section boundaries, benchmarks, and recorded elevations encouraged a certain faith in measurement. On paper, the spur route looked like an efficient traverse, a steady climb, a clean descent, and then the basin. It also seemed reasonable because the men were not attempting a long expedition. They packed like men going out for a day and a night, not like men preparing to be lost. The inventory of their supplies survives in a small claim filed later by Hatton's widow. It lists bacon, coffee, salt, a sack of beans, a tin of matches, 2 candles, a small coil of rope, and a hatchet. They carried snowshoes, but only 1 pair, Dyer's. The others intended to break trail in boots where the snow was packed. The mule was left behind because the spur, as Klein described it, looked too tight for animals. Their normalcy is visible in the small plans they made for after the trip. Dyer told the exchange operator he would be back in town tomorrow evening late. Hatton promised his wife he would attend Sunday service. Klein asked the store clerk to set aside a replacement coat button. Later, those details would acquire a cruel weight, as ordinary intentions often do when people don't return. There were warning signs, but they were subtle enough that the men either discounted them or filed them away as background. The weather in early January had been unstable, a thaw, then a hard freeze. Snow that looks firm from a distance can collapse into crust and pockets. The local paper in Bend mentioned chimney smoke driven low and wind shifting in the high country, the kind of phrasing that conveyed discomfort without claiming crisis. In a sheriff's report written after the disappearance, a line appears that reads like an apology for not having intervened. No storm warnings were issued. Conditions were common for the season. And that, too, is how these things happen. Not in extraordinary blizzards that make for stories, but in familiar winter that invites routine. The shortcut promised to save time. It was also, in a quiet way, a wager that the land would behave as expected, and that their experience would cover any small surprises. Under normal circumstances, that wager often pays, but the documents show that the men were not simply trusting the land. They were trusting the map, trusting their memory, trusting their sense of direction, and trusting daylight. In winter, in timber, daylight is not a long companion. It ends quickly, and it ends without negotiation. A later claim filed by Hatton's widow included an itemized list of supplies, an unusually detailed record that reveals how lightly the men packed for what they believed was a short, predictable crossing. The precise moment the shortcut became irreversible cannot be photographed, but it can be approached from multiple angles, like a historian triangulating a fact from imperfect witnesses. The men left Bend on the morning of January 13th. That date is fixed by 2 independent sources: the exchange log that recorded Dyer placing a brief call just after 8 o'clock, and the general store ledger showing a purchase of coffee and matches the same morning. The clerk later testified that they looked in a hurry but not worried. From Bend, they followed the wagon road as long as it remained passable, then cut off where the packed track narrowed and disappeared under drifting. The last person known to have seen them, an older teamster hauling a small load of feed, told the sheriff that the 3 stopped briefly, adjusted straps, and then went up toward the timber, off the main. In reconstruction, what comes next must be restrained. There is a temptation, in disappearances, to inflate the unknown into drama. But the records do not support drama. They support the slow erosion of certainty. The spur they chose rose through fir and ponderosa, where snow collects unevenly and wind scours exposed points down to hard crust. The day was cold, but not violently so. There was light. There were long shadows. The air, according to a later weather summary from a nearby station, was dry enough that sound carried in a clean, distant way. One can imagine their pace, boots punching through crust, then finding firmer patches, the single pair of snowshoes alternating between men when the snow deepened, the small, habitual silences of people who have worked together. The evidence suggests they were moving with intention, not wandering. Hatton's diary contains one more entry, written in a pencil hand that presses hard. Timber thick, keep ridge. It is not the entry of a man who thinks he is lost. It is the entry of a man who believes the problem is merely inconvenience. The problem begins when ridges begin to resemble one another. In winter forest, landmarks disappear. The horizon is blocked. A slope that looks like a continuous climb can hide a shallow bowl, and a shallow bowl can feed a drainage that pulls a traveler gently away from the intended line. The shortcut depended on staying on the spur, on keeping the high ground and avoiding the drainages that run like quiet traps toward deeper country. A later search party found what they believed were the men's tracks at approximately the elevation where the spur narrows. The sheriff wrote that the tracks showed a stop, some turning, and then a continuation. That description matters because it suggests the first moment of doubt, the brief pause when three men, standing among trees, tried to reconcile what they saw with what they expected. Klein's belief in the map would have been strongest here, where the line on paper demanded confidence. Dyer, more experienced, would have been cautious, but also aware of the social cost of caution. The way hesitation can look like fear. Hatton, older and proud, would have wanted forward motion, because forward motion is how men prove competence to themselves. No testimony records an argument. But later, in a letter written by Dyer's co-worker to the sheriff, there is a sentence offered secondhand. Laurie said the boy was sure of it and Charlie didn't want to turn. It is thin evidence, but it fits the pattern of human decision-making. Someone is sure, someone is stubborn, someone yields because yielding is easier than conflict. And so the decision occurs not as a single dramatic choice, but as a sequence of small permissions. They permit themselves to continue because the ridge still feels like a ridge. They permit themselves to believe the basin is on the other side of the next rise. They permit themselves to assume that if they are slightly off, they can correct it later. By mid-afternoon, the light would have begun to flatten, turning the forest into a pattern of gray trunks and muted snow. The wind, according to later reports from men working lower down, rose and shifted. Not a storm, but enough to disturb the fine surface and soften the clarity of tracks. At this point, any wise traveler who suspects misalignment chooses a known line, downhill to water or backtracking to a previous certainty. But backtracking requires admitting that hours have been spent in error. It requires turning away from the idea of being almost there. The final confirmed action, the last point where the documents stop being inference and become fact, is anchored to an object. On January 18th, 5 days after the men left Bend, a search party found a small campfire scar in a sheltered pocket near a stand of fir. Nearby were 2 candle stubs and a strip of bacon rind. There was also, according to the sheriff, paper ash with trace of blue line. That was interpreted as a piece of a map burned either for warmth, light, or because it had ceased to be useful. The campfire was not in itself proof of disaster. It was proof of survival to that point. It showed they had not panicked immediately. It showed they had made shelter and attempted to conserve. Most importantly, it showed that by that night, they were still moving forward on the assumption that forward was correct. In the absence of further tracks, lost to wind overlaid by new snow, the fire becomes the last fixed mark. From there, the record goes silent. The sheriff noted paper ash with trace of blue line near the fire scar, consistent with early USGS blue line map printing, suggesting the men may have burned part of the very document guiding them. Searches in 1911 were not cinematic operations. They were local, improvised, and constrained by weather, manpower, and money. The sheriff assembled volunteers, teamsters, trappers, and a few men from the telephone company. They moved out in staggered parties because no one could abandon work for long, and because the terrain itself punished large groups. The official record shows a familiar rhythm, a flurry of activity, then delays, then renewed efforts when weather permitted. Notices were posted in Bend and Sisters. The local paper printed the men's names, then reprinted them with slightly different spellings. One article suggested the men had been caught by a sudden storm. Another insisted they must have made the Metolius camp and are delayed. Contradictions grew the way they always grow when absence creates space for speculation. But the sheriff's writing remains stubbornly narrow. He focuses on the same axis again and again, where they left the known road, where they were last traced, and what direction the spur would have guided them if they were wrong. In his report, he lists the logical possibilities. They fell into a drainage and were carried deeper into timber, unable to regain the ridge. They attempted to follow water downhill, expecting it to lead them to a known river crossing, and misjudged the basin. They remained on high ground too long, grew exhausted, and attempted a descent in failing light. None of these are sensational. They are the quiet outcomes of miscalculation. The fire scar discovered on January 18th became the pivot point. From it, searchers fanned outward. They found nothing else that could be definitively tied to the men. No clothing, no tools, no pack straps. That absence led to a theory that appears in later correspondence, that the men, realizing their error, continued moving at speed, unwilling to linger in one place long enough to leave an obvious trail. A particular kind of tragedy emerges in those pages, the tragedy of continuing to act as if time can be saved after time has already been lost. In February, a trapper reported finding voices in the timber at night, then could not relocate the spot by daylight. The sheriff noted the claim and did not endorse it. That is as close as the record comes to anything resembling rumor, and even there, it remains skeptical. By March, the county commissioners questioned the cost of continued searches. In the minutes of a meeting, a commissioner is recorded as saying that further parties should be undertaken only if conditions improve. It is a bureaucratic sentence, but it marks the point where the disappearance becomes administratively tolerable. The county had other concerns: roads, disputes, taxes. 3 missing men could not indefinitely dominate the public ledger. Spring brought melt, then mud, then new work. When the snow retreated, searchers returned. If bodies had been exposed, they might have been found. If possessions had surfaced, they might have been identified. But the land did not offer that closure. Instead, what appeared were small contradictions that made the case feel both solvable and unsolvable. One party claimed the men must have gone north because the fire scar was too far that way. Another insisted the fire scar proved nothing because anyone could have camped there. A telephone company foreman testified that Dyer knew the longer route well enough that he would never have risked the spur, then admitted under questioning that Dyer had, in fact, agreed to it. Everything turned back again to the single choice to leave the known road. If they had remained on the wagon line, they might have arrived late, tired, but traceable. If they had taken the longer arc, their footprints would have intersected with other trails, and someone eventually would have crossed them. If they had carried enough supplies to wait out uncertainty, they might have survived long enough to be found. But the shortcut stripped away margin. It narrowed options. It forced speed. And when doubt appeared, it made turning back feel like failure. In the records, the consequence is not merely that they disappeared. The consequence is that after that decision, every corrective action available to them required admitting error, something human beings resist even when survival depends on it. County Commissioner meeting minutes later questioned the expense of continued search parties, a bureaucratic record that shows exactly when the disappearance shifted from urgent emergency to manageable loss. Decades later, the case persisted not because it remained actively investigated, but because it remained unresolved in a way that suited local memory. Bend grew, roads improved, the telephone lines multiplied until they became ordinary, until people stopped remarking on the miracle of hearing a voice from miles away. And yet the three names continued to surface in small, predictable places. In family histories, in a church memorial book, in the occasional newspaper column about old mysteries, and in the file drawer of the county clerk, where the original report lay folded and refolded, the creases darkened by handling. A historian approaching the case in the 1930s, when enough time had passed for sentiment to cool, would find the disappearance unusually clean. There were no suspects, no crimes, no court proceedings. There was only the gradual assembling of a narrative from practical documents. In that assembling, the men become clearer, not as symbols, but as people. Dyer's letter to his brother, in which he complained about wire work and winter, reads differently when one knows he never came back to complain again. Hatton's diary, with its small, steady entries, becomes a testament to routine, the way routine can endure right up to the edge of catastrophe. Klein's enthusiasm for maps and efficiency reads as youthful confidence, but also as something broader. The early 20th century's belief that measurement could tame uncertainty. By the time the historian writes, the landscape itself has changed. New roads cut across old spurs. Logging altered the timber. Fires erased some of the older stands and replaced them with younger growth. What was once a confusing ridgeline might now be an obvious grade. What was once an isolated basin might now have a named track and a camp. That change creates the illusion that the disappearance should be solvable, if only someone could walk the route and see what they missed. But the historian knows better. The past cannot be re-entered under the same conditions. A winter ridge in 1911 is not the same ridge decades later. The most sobering document in the file is a brief affidavit signed by Hatton's wife in 1913 when she petitioned for legal closure. The affidavit does not accuse anyone. It does not dramatize. It states facts. Her husband left with 2 men for work. He did not return. She sought support for their child. In the margin of that affidavit, a clerk later wrote a note that feels unintentionally philosophical. No evidence contrary. No evidence contrary to what? To the idea that they were dead. To the assumption that they did what they thought was reasonable. To the quiet conclusion that nothing criminal happened. Only a human sequence of choices under pressure. In historical disappearances, people often ask for the single moment where fate intervened. This case offers something more ordinary and more instructive. There was no fate in the supernatural sense. There was only a narrowing corridor of decisions, beginning with the belief that time could be saved. A shortcut is not merely a route, it is a philosophy, that efficiency is worth risk, that knowledge can be compressed, that caution is a kind of waste. In most daily life, that philosophy is rewarded. It makes work faster, it makes people feel competent, it creates the pleasant sense of having outsmarted inconvenience. In the high timber in winter, it can also remove the last protections that keep error from becoming final. The historian, writing with restraint, does not condemn them. The records do not support condemnation. They were not careless boys. They were working men operating within the logic of their era. An era that believed paper and progress could tame distance, that believed an hour saved was an hour earned. The decision to leave the known road did not guarantee death, but it made survival dependent on a chain of correct judgments made under worsening conditions with shrinking daylight and rising fatigue. And the historian knows that human beings, even capable ones, rarely make a perfect chain of judgments when they are cold, uncertain, and unwilling to admit they have misread the land. In the end, the file remains what it began as, a record of absence. 3 men took a shortcut to save time, and in doing so, they traded the certainty of being traceable for the illusion of being efficient. The land did not punish them out of malice. It simply did what winterland does when people step off the line that others can follow. The final line the historian writes is quiet, because the truth here is quiet. They did not vanish because the world is mysterious. only because a human decision, understandable in the moment, left them no room to be wrong.